Obviously, I enjoy taking notes. I built a whole brand off of note-taking and journals. As a player, I feel like it's super easy to take notes. You don't have as much to juggle, but I find that when I do take notes as a DM, it's been highly lacking. I looked for a way to get better at that. And so I found these tips and they were helpful for me. I also am putting my own little spin on it from just how I do things. But none of this is rocket science, so I'm sure you've heard some of these things before, but hopefully this is just a reminder then for you to be easy with yourself and help you take better notes and DM and juggle all the 8 million things you have to do as a DM. So the first tip that I have is to actually prepare yourself for note-taking, which I know seems like simple, right? Wrong. If you're not prepared either with like a piece of paper and a pencil or your digital, OneNote or whatever it is you're using, and it's not readily available before you start the session, I find that I end up not taking notes at all. Now, I would also argue that a digital format is more likely to get you distracted, because me personally, if I take notes on my phone or I use a computer to take notes, I get distracted by all the other things that my computer or my phone can do, right? Like you get distracted by notifications, you get distracted by stuff on the internet or whatever you were looking up last or whatever. It's super easy to get distracted and take away from that. So for me personally, just a piece of paper and a pen is all you really need to make sure you're taking notes, to make sure you're prepared for this tip. That includes not needing any fancy notebook or anything. Now, obviously I sell fancy notebooks, but I don't use any of that world building stuff or anything in my notebooks for the actual session notes. I tend to have my session prep already done on the note page, and then I use that sidebar column and I use shorthand to keep track of things that might pertain to either the stuff on the left or to things happening during the session. You don't need a fancy journal, you just need a piece of paper and a pen or pencil. Your choice. You don't need any fancy highlighters, any multicolored pens or anything like that. To me, even stickers and stuff, that's just distracting. And you don't have time to be distracted if you're DMing. And that's the reason most people have a problem or have trouble taking notes, is because they feel like they don't have any time to. So let's make time. The next tip I have is to use keywords only. I don't know what this hand motion's for. Obviously, full sentences are completely overkill. You don't have time to write that. You probably don't have time to read it later. Everything should be bullet point. There's also a difference between using bullet points and just keywords. Now, when you're a player, I tend to bullet point and write phrases. As a DM, you kind of just want your nouns. You don't need prepositions, you don't need any of that. You just need enough to remember what's going on, and that tends to be nouns, sometimes verbs. Instead of writing, the players entered the city to argue with the mayor over the use of artifacts building their town wall. That's a mouthful. Instead, I would probably just write something like players v mayor dash artifact, and that will be enough to remind you what they did. The next thing, and this kind of falls under that making time and making things easy, is to just jot your notes down immediately after the session. And I do this even as a player, because sometimes things are happening so fast that I don't have time to jot down important things. I like to archive my locations and my people and make sure they're all in one place, and I do that after session. I don't do it during the session. The same thing would apply to you as a DM. Personally, I do this before I even pack up anything. It actually takes me maybe 2-3 minutes to do this before I pack everything up. And I do, in particular, 2 things. I try to answer the question, will I forget this if I don't write this down? Especially now that I've had a kid, I have serious mom brain, and I can't remember, what I ate for breakfast this morning. If I feel like I'm going to forget it, it needs to be written down. A lot of times, though, there are things during your D&D session that either you prepared for, right? Encounters, NPCs, that kind of thing, places, dungeons, whatever. You've already prepared those things. You probably don't need to write that down again. There's also moments that maybe your players do that are just going to be memorable, and you're not going to need to write those down either. Like when your ranger stops those vampire spawns with an AoE spell and gives them an advantage in the fight. Those kinds of things are so memorable that you really don't need to write them down unless you like want it to be more of like a memory keeping kind of thing. Instead, you need to focus on things that you think you'll forget next time. You can be doing this even during the session and writing it down, but I found that if I first did that when I was writing essentially my summary, I found that it was easier for me to know when I might forget something during the session. So it kind of built that habit, made me kind of be more aware of what was going on that I would know I would need to write down later. So start by doing it at the end of your session and then slowly transition to like answering that question during your session. The other thing I do at the end is I try to summarize what happened in 3 sentences, which is hard sometimes if the players do a lot of stuff. I think this is also a good starting point for when you're starting your session prep for the next session, or as a recap for what happened last time to your players. And so I think summarizing it in 3 sentences also will jog my memory as to what else is going on in the note-taking part of this page. I highly recommend doing that. The end of the session is also the perfect time to dissect anything that might seem a little vague later. So again, kind of falling back into that, will I forget what this means later? You want to go through and maybe add a few more words to certain bullet points. You're essentially trying to make it so that these notes are actually useful for you in the future. Because if you're not using your notes that you're taking, why are you even taking notes? Now is the time to add an additional word or two, maybe another verb or noun. So for instance, in our example earlier, maybe player versus mayor artifacts isn't enough for you. Maybe you need to add in the word reputation with the city guard plummets. Not only does that give you more details on the outcome of what happened, but it also will help you plan for maybe future encounters. Say they run into city guard, now you know exactly how to use your notes from last time and the way they discussed things with the mayor last time to influence the way the townsfolk view them. One other thing I think DMs forget is that your players, hopefully, are paying attention to and they're taking notes. In a couple of my one-shots and things, I do have one player that tends to take more notes than everybody else because she does like to handwrite things. In my Curse of Strahd game, where I'm a player, I'm the note taker. I often remind the DM of things that happened, and that's perfectly fine. Now, they won't remember all those little things that you're trying to keep secret from them, like, oh, the city guard reputation has plummeted. Being able to ask a player, you know, what they remember also helps you know what is important to them, what they felt like was important for them to write down. That could influence how you prepare for the next session. Another thing you can do is at the end of the session, as you're writing your little summary, ask them to like give one thing they thought was important. I hope that this offers you a good starting point to take better notes as a DM. If you're also a player or you have players that you want to take notes, I have this video over here which will kind of go over a very similar amount of stuff with shorthand and all of that. It's older, so apologies because it seems super cheesy to me now, but it's fine. So you can watch that video over here, and then I also plan on adding a video in the future about what exactly you should be taking notes on.